law is. So to understand that, we need to know what human rights are, right? So human rights are basically rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of their race, their sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Human rights include all the rights, including right to life, liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, right to work and education, and many more. Now, everyone is entitled to these rights without discrimination. Now, international human rights law lays down the obligations to the governments to act in certain ways or refrain from certain acts in order to promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedom of individual or groups. One of the great achievements of United Nations is the creation of a comprehensive body of human rights law, which is a universal and internationally protected code to which all nations can subscribe and all people can aspire. The United Nations has a broad range of internationally accepted rights, including civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights. It has also established mechanisms to promote and protect these rights and to assist states in carrying out their responsibilities. The foundations of this body of law are the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which are adopted by the General Assembly in 1945 and 1948, respectively. Since then, the United Nations has gradually expanded the human rights law to encompass specific standards for women, children, people with disabilities, minorities, and other vulnerable groups. They now possess the rights which protect them from discrimination that had long been common in many societies. Now, let us understand what Universal Declaration of Human Rights is. It is a milestone document in the history of human rights, which was drafted by representatives with different legal and cultural backgrounds from all regions of the world. The declaration was proclaimed by United Nations General Assembly in Paris on 10th December 1948 by General Assembly Resolution 217A within brackets 3 as a common standard of achievements for all people and all nations. It sets out for the first time fundamental human rights to be universally protected. Since its adoption in 1948, the UDHR has been translated into more than 500 languages. The translated document, just hang on 1 second. The translated document in the world has inspired the constitutions of many newly independent states and many new democracies. The UDHR, together with the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights and its two optional protocols on the complaints and procedures of the death penalty, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and its optional protocol form the so-called International Bill of Human Rights. Now, the economic, social, and cultural rights basically includes the human rights that the covenant seeks to promote and protect. This came into force in 1976, and this includes the right to work in just and favorable conditions, right to social protection, to an adequate standard of living, and to the highest attainable standards of physical and mental well-being, the right to education and enjoyment of benefits of cultural freedom and scientific progress. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and its first optional protocol was entered into force in 1976, as I spoke before. The second optional protocol was adopted in 1989. The covenant deals with such rights as freedom of movement, equality before law, the right to a free trial and presumption of innocence, freedom of thought and conscience, religion, freedom of opinion, expression, peaceful assembly, freedom of association, participation in public affairs and elections, and protection of minority rights. It basically prohibits arbitrary deprivation of life, torture, cruel or degrading treatment, or punishment, which also includes slavery, forced labor, arbitrary arrest, detention, arbitrary interference with privacy, war propaganda, discrimination, and advocacy of racial or religious hatred. A series of international human rights treaties and its other instruments adopted since 1945 have expanded the body of international human rights law. They include Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which was brought in 1948, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which was brought in 1965, the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which was brought in 1979, and the Convention on Rights of the Child in 1989. There was also a convention that was brought in for the rights of persons with disabilities, but this was much later in 2006, among others. Now let us understand what Human Rights Council is. It was established on March 15, 2006 by the General Assembly and reported directly to it, replaced the 60-year-old UN Commission on Human Rights. As the key to intergovernmental body responsible for human rights, this council is made up of 47 state representatives and is tasked with strengthening the promotion and protection of human rights around the globe by addressing situations of human rights violations, making recommendations on them, and including responding to human rights emergencies. The most innovative feature of the Human Rights Council is the Universal Periodic Review. This unique mechanism involves a review of the human rights records of all 192 UN members, and it occurs once every 4 years. The review is a cooperative, state-driven process under the auspices of the Council, which provides for the opportunity of each state to present measures taken and challenges to be met to improve human rights situations in their country and to meet their international obligations. The review is designed to ensure universality and equality of treatment for every country. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights exercises principal responsibility for UN human rights activities. The High Commissioner is mandated to respond to serious violations of human rights and to undertake preventive action. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or the OHCHR, is the focal point of the United Nations human rights activities. It serves as the secretariat for the Human Rights Council, the treaty's bodies, expert committees that monitor the treaty compliance, and other UN human rights organs. It also undertakes human rights field activities. Most of the core human rights treaties have an oversight body which is responsible for reviewing and the implementation of that treaty by the countries that have ratified it. Individuals whose rights have been violated can file complaints directly to the committees, and they oversee the human rights treaty. Now, human rights and the UN system. Human rights is a cross-cutting theme in all UN policies and programs, and in the key areas of peace and security, development, humanitarian assistance, and economic and social affairs. As a result, virtually every UN body and specialized agency is involved to some degree in the protection of human rights. Some examples are the right to development, which is at the core of the Sustainable Development Goals, the right to food championed by the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, labor rights defined and protected by the International Labour Organization, gender equality, which is promulgated by UN Women, and the rights of children, indigenous people, and disabled persons. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UDHR, is generally agreed to by the foundation of the international human rights law. It was adopted in 1948, and the UDHR has inspired a rich body of legally binding international human rights treaties. This continues to be an inspiration to all of us, whether in addressing injustices, in times of conflicts, in societies suffering repression, and in our efforts towards achieving universal enjoyment of human rights. It represents the universal recognition that basic rights and fundamental freedoms are inherent to all human beings, inalienable, and equally applicable to everyone, and that every one of us is born free and equal in dignity and in rights. Whatever our nationality is, our place of residence, gender, national or ethnic origin, or whether the color of our skin, religion, language, or any other status, the international community has a commitment to uphold the dignity and justice for all of us. And this was made in December 10, 1948. Now, foundation for our common future. Over the years, the commitment has been translated into law, whether in the forms of treaties, customary international law, general principles, regional agreements, and domestic laws through which human rights are expressed and guaranteed. Indeed, the UDHR has inspired more than 80 international human rights treaties and declarations, which is a great number of regional human rights conventions, domestic human rights bill, constitutional provisions, which together constitute a comprehensive, legally binding system for the promotion and protection of human rights. Building on the achievements of the UDHR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights was entered into force in 1976. The two covenants have developed most of the rights already enshrined in the UDHR, making them effectively binding on the states that have ratified them. They set forth everyday rights, such as the right to life, equality before law, freedom of expression, rights to work, social security, and education. Together with the UDHR, the covenants comprise of the International Bill of Human Rights. Over time, international human rights treaties have become more focused and specialized regarding both the issue addressed and the social groups identified as requiring protection. The body of international human rights law continues to grow, evolve, and further elaborate the fundamental rights and freedoms contained in the International Bill of Rights, and addressing concerns such as racial discrimination, torture, enforced disappearances, disabilities, and the rights of women, children, migrants, minorities, and indigenous people. The core principles of human rights first set out in the UDHR, such as universality, interdependence, and indivisibility, equality, non-discrimination, and that human rights are simultaneously entailed with both rights and obligations from duty bearers and the right owners. This has been reiterated in numerous international human rights conventions, declarations, resolutions, and today all United Nations member states have ratified at least one of the 9 core international human rights treaties, and 80% have ratified 4 or more, giving concrete expression to the universality of the UDHR and international human rights. Now, how does international law protect human rights? International human rights law lays down the obligation which states are bound to respect. By becoming parties to international treaties, state assumes the obligation, duties under the international law to respect and protect and to fulfill human rights. The obligation to respect means that the states must refrain from interfering with or curtailing the enjoyment of human rights. The obligation to protect requires the states to protect individuals and groups against human rights abuses. The obligation to fulfill means that the state must take positive action to facilitate the enjoyment of basic human rights. Through ratification and international human rights treaties, governments undertake to put in place domestic measures and legislations compatible with their treaty or obligations and duty. The domestic legal system therefore provides the principal legal protection of human rights guaranteed under the international law. Where domestic legal proceedings fail to address human rights abuses, mechanisms and procedures for individual and group complaints are available at the regional and international level to help them ensure that international human rights standards are indeed respected, implemented, and enforced at the local level. The International Bill of Rights is basically what ensures your right to equality, freedom from discrimination, and it means that all are equal before the eyes of law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of law. All are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination in violation of this declaration and against any incitement to such discrimination. The general principle of equality and non-discrimination is fundamental element of international human rights law. The useful definition of non-discrimination is contained in Article 1 within brackets 1 ILO 111, which provides that discrimination includes any distinction, exclusion, or preference made on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, political opinion, national extraction, or social origin, which has effect on nullifying or impairing the equality of opportunity or treatment in the employment or occupation. Thus, the right to equal treatment requires that all persons be treated equally before the law, before discrimination. The principle of equality and the non-discrimination guarantees that those in equal circumstances are dealt with equally in law and practice. However, it is important to stress that not every distinction or difference in treatment will amount to discrimination. In general, international law, a violation of the principle of non-discrimination arises if A, equal cases are treated in different manner, or B, a difference in treatment does not have an objective or reasonable justification. Also, this means that there is no proportionality between the aim and sought the means employed. These requirements have been expressly set out by international human rights supervisory bodies, including the European Court, the Inter-American Court, there are advisory opinions, and the Human Rights Committee. The principle of equality can, in certain circumstances, require a state to take affirmative action. All right, okay. So I just got your message. All right, fine. I'll go a little slow. So the principle of equality can, in certain circumstances, require a state to take affirmative action in order to diminish or eliminate conditions that cause or perpetuate discrimination. The Human Rights Committee has clearly stated this obligation in General Comment 18 and the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which frequently refers to the duty of affirmative action in its concluding observations. The right to life, liberty, and personal security comes under Article 5 and it focuses on protecting individuals' freedoms from unreasonable detention as opposed to protecting personal safety. You have a right to your personal freedom. This means you must not be imprisoned or detained without good reason. Article 5 protects your right to liberty and security. It focuses on protecting individuals' freedoms from unreasonable detention, as opposed to protecting personal safety. You have a right to your personal freedom. This means that you may not be imprisoned or detained without a justified reason. If you are arrested, the Human Rights Act provides that you have a right in which that you have to be told in a language that you understand why you have been arrested, what charges you face, you should be taken to court promptly, you have the right to acquire a bail, which means a temporary release while the court process continues. I think most of you know that, subject to certain conditions. You also have a right to have a trial within the reasonable time. It doesn't mean that you will be imprisoned for 3 years and then you'll have a trial. It should happen within a reasonable time. You can go to the court. You can challenge your detention if you think it is unlawful, of course. And you're also liable to be paid compensation in case you are unlawfully detained. I will explain at the end of the lecture. I will explain everything. Um, Now, there are restrictions to this right of being detained or being arrested unlawfully or lawfully. Um, the restrictions that apply, they apply in certain circumstances in which public authorities can detain you as long as they can within the law, right? They can't do it unlawfully. This applies, for example, if you have been found guilty of a crime, all right, and then you've been sent to prison. Or, for example, you have not done something and a court has ordered you to do something that you have to be under arrest if the court has ordered you. Then there is also reasonable suspicion that you might have committed a crime and someone is trying to stop you from committing a crime, therefore they arrest you or detain you so that you don't commit that crime. And also it includes that if you're trying to run away after committing a crime, so they can lawfully detain you. um, then of course there's a restriction if you have a mental health condition. For example, if you are a schizophrenic and you can't stay detained, then they would detain you. I'm trying to explain as I go. I hope this helps. Okay. Okay, apart from that, there is another restriction, that is if you're capable of spreading infectious disease. Now, in the times of coronavirus, for example, if a person has coronavirus, they will obviously not be detained in the jail so that they don't transmit the disease to other people, right? So it is basically self-explanatory, but still I am trying to explain as we go. Okay, and then there you can be detained if you are trying to enter the country illegally. For example, if you don't have a visa or you don't have a valid visa, you can be detained, right? Um, then there is another cause if you can be detained, which is if you are going to be deported or extradited. In that case, also any country has the right to detain you or arrest you, because there is a chance that you might run away and you might commit some crime. So this is when you have been accused of a crime in your home country and you have to be sent. So that's extradition basically. Now let's go to Article 5, which I talked about briefly earlier. It is basically right to liberty. Now everyone has the right to liberty and security of their person. Now of their person means themselves. Uh, Now no one can be deprived of this right unless one, a lawful detention of a person happens after conviction. Now, if you have been convicted by a court of law, then you don't have this right. You don't have the right to liberty, because if you have committed a crime and you have been directed by the court to be under arrest, then you will have to stay in detention, and then non-compliance can be a whole thing. It can lead to contempt of court, and therefore that is illegal. So you will have to be detained. Now, other thing is that lawful arrest. There are two things: detention as well as arrest. Lawful arrest basically means that if there is a court order against you, and then you are not you're not complying with that court order, there is non-compliance, and then you are arrested. All right. And then point number 3, lawful arrest or detention of a person effected for the purpose of bringing him before competent authority. Now this happens in case a court has sent you various forms of communication and they want you to be present before the court, but you have been avoiding those things, such as if you have warrants sent against you and you don't appear before the court despite having a warrant in your name, then the court has the authority to send a police officer to your place, and they have the authority to arrest you and bring you before the court. All right. So that is what this basically means. Now, point number 4 is detention of a minor by lawful order for the purpose of educational supervision, or his lawful detention for the purpose of him bringing before the competent authority. Like we discussed earlier, the second part is basically what I just said, and this only applies to the minor, of course. Also, they talk about educational supervision. Now, educational supervision would basically mean that in case a minor requires education and is unable to do that, so for that he can be detained and be educated. Lawful detention of persons for the prevention of spreading of infectious disease. I actually discussed this a while back, but this basically means that if a person has infectious disease and they can spread it, they are detained in a separate place as compared to a prison, because there's a risk of transmission. Um, Detention of persons of unsound mind, alcoholics, drug addicts, or vagrants. Now, this all comes under the same category. Then, the lawful arrest or detention of a person to prevent his affecting an unauthorized entry to the country, or of a person against whom action is being taken with a view to deportation and extradition. This also I have just covered, but it basically means that Unauthorized entry in a country is wrong, obviously. If a person does not have a lawful visa, if they don't have a legal document to allow them in a country, then they will obviously be detained. Uh, Everyone who is arrested shall be informed promptly in a language which they understand, the reasons for their arrest, and all the charges that will be framed against them. Everyone arrested or detained in accordance with the provisions of paragraph 1C of this article shall be brought promptly before a judge or other officer authorized by law to exercise judicial power and shall be entitled to trial within a reasonable time or to release pending trial. Release may be conditioned with guarantees or appear for the trial. Everyone who is deprived of his liberty by arrest or detention shall be entitled to take proceedings by which the lawfulness of his detention shall be decided speedily by a court and his release ordered. Okay, so I just told you that this comes under paragraph 1C. I just told you the law. So someone had just raised a query. So I'm just answering that. Uh, Now, point number 5, anyone who has been a victim of arrest or detention in contravention of the provisions of this article shall have enforceable right to compensation. Now, for example, you are detained unlawfully, okay? If you're detained unlawfully, the officer does not give you a reason for your arrest. They don't give you they don't give you the rights that you have. They don't tell you the reason for your arrest. They don't bring you in front of a judge. They don't give you the right to basically plead your case. In that case, you will have the right to compensation. You will obviously be compensated for the agony that you have faced if it is a wrongful arrest. Now, Article 3 of the UDHR talks about freedom from torture of degrading treatment. I am mentioning the articles, so please keep up. So, Article 3 basically protects you from number one, torture. Even if it's mental or it's physical, both sorts of torture is prohibited under Article 3 of the UDHR, Universal Declaration. Number two, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. All right, you cannot be treated less than a human. You have to be treated in accordance with your basic human decency. That's how they have to treat you. They can't treat you like an animal, right? They can't beat you or treat you in that way. They can't be degrading in any way. uh, then deportation or extradition. Now, if there's a real risk to you that you will go to your homeland and you have some risk to your life, they will not deport you or extradite you. And because this would mean that you are basically being treated in a inhuman fashion in your country, right? So therefore it is important that you don't be treated in your country the way an animal is treated. Basically, animals should not be treated that way either, but then we are talking about human rights right now. As you would expect, public authorities must not inflict such sort of treatment on you. They must also protect if someone is treating you in this way. If they know this right is being breached, they must intervene to stop it. The state must also investigate credible allegations of such treatment. Now, there are certain people who said that police beating people is okay, right? In the situations involving the CAA and NRC, a lot of people said that if a police is beating you with one stick or it's giving you one blow, it's fine. No, it is not. It is illegal under the international human rights law. They cannot do that, even if they are police. And the police authorities cannot do that. And if some other third person is doing it, they must intervene and stop it, right? They cannot cause you pain, they can stop your pain. Okay, now let us go to what torture entails. Now, torture basically occurs when someone is deliberately causing a very serious or cruel suffering, physical or mental, to another person. Now, this might be to punish someone, or to intimidate someone, or it could also be to obtain information. We see in movies all the time that a police officer is beating the criminal. We see this all the time. So that is basically torture. So you can't do that. That's illegal. What is inhuman treatment? Inhuman treatment or punishment is treatment which causes physical or mental suffering. It can include various things such as serious physical assault, psychological interrogation, cruel or barbaric detention conditions or restraints, serious physical or psychological abuse in a healthcare setting, or threatening to torture someone if the threat is real or immediate. And what is degrading treatment? Now, degrading treatment means a treatment which is extremely humiliating and undignified. Whether the treatment reaches a level that can be defined as degrading depends on a number of factors. This includes duration of the treatment, its physical or mental effects, and the sex, age, vulnerability, and health of the victim. This concept is based on the principle of dignity. The innate value of all human beings is basically dignity, and therefore one must be very careful not to be degrading towards another human being. Now, some people ask that are there any restrictions to this right? No, there are no restrictions to this right, because your right to not be tortured or treated in a inhuman or degrading way is completely absolute. Okay, and this means that it cannot ever be limited or restricted in any way whatsoever. For example, a public authority cannot use lack of resources as a defense against an accusation that it has treated someone in an inhuman or degrading way. Now, I will give you an example of how this is used. Now, for example, a young person with mental health problems is placed in residential care. Now, during the visit, his parents notice that there is bruising on his body. They raise this issue with whoever is taking care of him. But the person who's taking care of him basically says, no, no, there's nothing, and they dismiss their concerns. They were also, furthermore, banned from visiting their son. Now, the parents raise their right not to be treated in an inhuman or degrading way, and their right to respect for a family life. The ban on visits was revoked, and the bruising on the young man's body was investigated. So one cannot be treated in a degrading fashion, no matter how justified a person thinks that it is. I took this example from this book that I read, and it's called The Human Rights Act Changing Lives. And this was from British Institute of Human Rights 2006, if anyone wants to read. No, I cannot speak in Hindi. I have prepared my lecture in English. Someone is asking me to speak in Hindi. Uh, Now, what does this law say? This law basically says, now Article 3, as we were discussing, prohibition of torture, it basically means that no one should be subjected to torture. I mean, this is very self-explanatory, that one should not be treated as less of a human being. One should not be treated to torture or inhuman treatment or degrading treatment or a sort of punishment that causes one to feel that way, right? There was a case which was Chehel versus United Kingdom of 1996. Now, I will talk about this because this sort of includes racism as well. So we will discuss this as this is a very ongoing topic. Now, there was an Indian Sikh who was living in the UK, and he claimed that he would be tortured if he was deported back to our country, that is India, right? He was a very, very high profile supporter of Sikh separatism. As you must have read, Khalistan they were planning on creating. And therefore, he had this risk that if he went back to his homeland, he would be killed, right? UK still thought that maybe this fellow Chehel is a... Yes, I can mention it again. It is Chehel versus United Kingdom. This is from 1996. Now I'll just go ahead with the case law. UK thought that he was a terrorist because anyone who's not white is basically a terrorist in white people's eyes. So this is what they thought, that he's a terrorist, and they wanted to deport him. So in a very important case, which was, I'll mention another case if anyone wants to write this down. It was called European Court of Human Rights. It was pertaining to Article 3, and this prohibited their removal as he faced a real risk of torture or inhuman or degrading treatment back home in India. The court basically stressed that his suspected involvement in terrorism was irrelevant. Whether he was a separatist or not was irrelevant, because, as per Article 3, it is very, very absolute and it extends to any human being, regardless of what they did in the past. Right? This is very, very absolute, and one cannot be treated as less of a person merely because there is a suspicion of him being a terrorist. Right? So there has to be a right to equality. That is what it is basically mentioned. uh, I'll go further. Just hold on a second. Now, right to equality before law. We have previously also discussed this, and this is a law. This is a law that people have used in. This is a law that has been used in our constitution as well. Right to equality. We all have that fundamental right. Now, equality before law basically means equality under law, equality in the eyes of law, legal equality, and legal egalitarianism. Now, legal egalitarianism is basically equality with a fancy word. It is basically a principle that each independent being must be treated equally by the law, irrespective of their age, their caste, their sex, their sexual orientation, anything. They should be treated equal by the law. And that all people, regardless of their sex, age, gender, race, they're all equal and they all deserve the same kind of justice. The justice for the laws of justice for them has to be equal no matter what. Now I'm talking about Article 6, which is right to fair trial. This protects right to a fair trial and public trial or hearing if you're charged with a criminal offense and have to go to a court, or a public authority is making a decision that has an impact upon your civil rights or obligation. So basically, if your rights are in question, if your civil rights or your obligations are in question, you need to have a right to come to the court to actually determine whether or not a charge against you is fair or not. All right. So basically, you have the right to move the court in case you feel that your rights have been compromised, basically. And in this context, basically, your civil rights and obligations are those which are recognized in the areas of UK law. Now, I'm only speaking about the UK common law, because we're talking about international human rights. So basically, the common law applies. Now, UK law includes the property law, the planning law, family law, contract law, and employment law. These are five sorts of laws that we will be following in this further. Now, it is obviously a good idea to get further advice if you think the right to a fair and public hearing might apply to your case. Now, one needs to understand what a fair public hearing is. A fair public hearing is anything that is held within a reasonable time. Number one, it can't go on for long that one person decides we have to punish this person, so we will just drag their hearing on. That is not how it works. One has to allow that person to have a hearing within a specific frame of time, which is of a reasonable quantity. They cannot extend that period of time. The other thing that needs to be there in a fair public hearing is an independent and an impartial judge or a decision maker. Whoever is making a decision in your case has to be impartial. It can't be this that he's favoring the other party and it is blatantly obvious. One cannot do that. It's not fair. One has to be impartial. Again, I use the word that it's not fair. So when we speak of fair public hearing, one has to be a fair judge in it. Am I getting the call? No, all right. Okay, the third point is that you are given all the relevant information. If you are detained or you are arrested, or if um, any of the charges are levied against you, you still need all the relevant information. If you don't have the relevant information, what are you supposed to tell your lawyer, right? Therefore, one has to have all the relevant information. So whoever is detaining you or arresting you needs to give you that relevant information so as to allow you to have a fair public hearing. Okay. Next is, it is open to the public. Now, this obviously has a restriction that unless it is a high profile case, public interest can be excused. But if there is nothing to hide, one should allow one in a public hearing can talk about anything and everything. And one must not be limited to a private sort of conversation. One should have that freedom that one can talk in front of the entire public, right? The next point that there is allows you representation in an interpreter where appropriate, and is followed by a public decision. Now the decision has to be public to the, for example, the Ram Mandir case, the decision was public, everybody knew the decision, everybody knew that the Ram Mandir was being constructed, everybody had that information. So that information needs to be given to the public. uh, I said allows you representation and interpreter. This basically means that you get all the sufficient information whilst in the middle of the trial, which means that there are certain people who don't understand legal terminologies and they need an interpreter. That could be a lawyer or otherwise. Therefore, that is also important for you, because you need to understand all the facts and circumstances, and a decision in a public hearing cannot go against you unless you understand the repercussions of things. Now, my next point is basically what I just said. You also have the right to an explanation of how court or decision making authority reached its decision. So it's not this that someone will just decide your future that, okay, this person is a criminal. No, that's not how it works. One can ask for their explanation, one can understand what process was being followed by the court, one can ask these questions. Now, what rights do you have at a criminal trial? Now, you have the right to be presumed innocent until you are proven guilty. That is the most important. Then the other one is that you have to be told as early as possible of what you are accused of. You need to know the charges against you that have been framed by the authorities. You also have the right to remain silent. You don't have to tell the police or the authorities any information that you don't want to. Nothing can be taken out of you by torture. Like I said, nobody can beat you up, nobody can soak that information out, one can not force you to disclose anything, you can remain silent. You can have enough time to prepare your case. So for example, if you don't have a lawyer, a lawyer, okay, so this is my next point, right? Legal aid. So basically what it means is that funding for a lawyer, if you cannot afford one, and it is needed for the justice to be served, uh, even in normal course, if you are unable to afford a lawyer, a public prosecutor or a government lawyer is given to you free of charge so that you can plead your case and you can make your case, because we all have the right to justice, and even if we are criminals, we do have the right to justice, and that's for the court to decide. We do have it, I covered just now, we have enough time to prepare our case, which means that if you're not ready for it, no one can ask you to come to the court. You can take adjournments. As law students here and lawyers here must know that there is a provision that one can take adjournments to prepare their case. And yes, there is attend your trial. You can be present during the trial proceedings. No one can stop you from doing that. You can access all the relevant information, whatever it pertains to your trial. You can talk about what your side of the trial is, your side of the case is. So you are allowed to plead your case as well as make your case. You can speak about what you think went down. Even if a person thinks that you did something wrong, you can plead your side. Even if it's wrong, you can talk about it as to how you saw these things. You can also question the witnesses, the main witness who was against you. You can also call other witnesses. Of course, I covered that you can have an interpreter. I have my notes, so I'm continuously looking here. So you can call an interpreter in case you don't understand something. Things can be explained to you via an interpreter. And this, in short, basically means that all, whether you are innocent or you're guilty, you have equal rights as that of a guilty person, because as long as the trial is going on, nobody can say that this person is guilty. Now I will leave it here, and I will cover rest of the topics later. But yeah, I hope everything is clear to all of you.
Akram, thank you for an informative session on the topic. Now we will be taking some questions from the audience. So the question is by MS Radhika. The question is, in case of disabled or unsound person, is there any way to help him with the dispute?
See, the thing is that I covered this earlier. I started with all of this, that there has been a charter that has been added for women, children, and people with disabilities. So, of course, people with disabilities are covered, and there can be help given by the authorities to the disabled person in order to help them in whatever legal way possible.
Akram, so another question by the same person. In this law, any death punishment is given or not under this law?
We are talking about human rights, right? So basically, we have a very reformative sort of a theory. Even in our country, we sort of think that one should have a chance to reform first, and death should be given only in extreme cases, right? We all try to avoid it as much as possible, of course. And I think that even in the international human rights, I believe that death penalty is the last resort, and one tries to avoid it as much as possible. But yes, in case it is a serious matter, then of course things are the death penalty is also one of the results that one has to take.
Okay, ma'am. So, ma'am, the other question is that, ma'am, does the docket exploitation theory existed in the courts also?
Hmm. I have this prepared for tomorrow. I will cover this.
Okay, okay,
Right, right.
yes. So, we have another question by Ms. Ananya Singh. The question is, can the cases of violation of human rights be entertained in the ICJ?
Of course, they can be. But with that, I will also say that the ICJ covers only very limited sort of litigation. They don't take up every matter. But in case the dispute is between two countries, for example, if a person from India is basically, let's talk about Kulbhushan Jadhav, right? Let's just talk about that.
Yes.
So in that matter, you all know what happened. I think all of you must have read it. It was very popular a few years back. So in that situation, of course, to protect the human rights of Mr. Jadhav, one had to move the International Court of Justice, and that was his the violation of his human rights, of course. But that doesn't happen in every case, right? That happens if the dispute is between two countries. So it's not in every small dispute.
Okay, ma'am. So the next question is by Ms. S. Rathina Savapati. The question is, what determines the rarest of rare criteria, the rareness in occurrence or the rareness in seriousness?
All right. So you might all remember in 2013, Nirbhaya was brutally gang raped, right? We all know about that. It's not a new concept in our country. The rape part of things is not a new concept, right? Women are being harassed, women and men alike are being harassed in the country on a daily basis. They get sexually assaulted and all of that. But what I believe is that that particular instance of Nirbhaya was something that everybody was shocked to learn, right? We can, as humans, we know what is rare, right? As humans, we understand what is extreme. As humans, we can see that this was too much, right? We understand all of that. Judges are humans too, right? So I believe that that's how you decide what rarest of rare is. If it's extreme, if you can in your head think that it is rare, of course I'm sure that even the judges can.
Okay, now that was a nice answer to it. So the next question is by Mr. Abdul Rauf. The
Yeah.
question is how to make use of human rights law to free a person who has been given UAPA in unjust.
See, this will become a very political thing if we talk about UAPA. But yes, human rights do apply there. They of course do, but right to dissent also is allowed in our country. It was, at least. Now, if that right has been taken away by the bringing out of UAPA, it's basically curtailing your right. So therefore one can use human rights, but then who is going to listen to you? If the judiciary is not listening to you, who is going to listen to you? So you do not have a choice. But yes, human rights do apply in the UAPA. Even when so many activists have been arrested under the UAPA, including this girl Safura, and that was a clear human rights violation because this woman was pregnant, and that was completely illegal and completely immoral to have arrested her. But she was arrested for a few months before she was finally released on bail. So therefore, it is a very complicated thing. It becomes all political once we talk about UAPA, because then that will be a whole other webinar. That can be another.
Absolutely. So the next question is by Ms. Jyoti Kumari. The question is, are violations enforceable? And are, if so, are they binding on the parties?
See, in human rights, a lot of the cases, a lot of the directions are not binding because they can just give a recommendation. The ICJ, for example, can give a recommendation. But in certain cases, yes, I feel they are binding, and one must follow those. But then again, the situation of your country and the government of your country plays a massive role in it. So that is a whole different story and a whole different issue. But yes, they do. It is not binding, but yes, it should be. I believe that it should be.
Okay, ma'am. So the next question is by Dr. Amit Kumar Das.
Yeah.
The question is, in case of conflict between international human rights law and the state law, which will prevail?
See, basically, the guidelines of a state prevails, I feel. But at the same time, the this is just about the guidelines. Guidelines of the state prevail, but at the same time, a, a recommendation can be given from the human rights law, and then that can be followed as well. So yeah.
Okay,
Because
ma'am.
what I basically mean to say is that since it is not binding on anyone, therefore I feel that the state's law would prevail. Yes.
Okay, ma'am. So, ma'am, a question from a personal note. Ma'am, what is the viewpoint of the judiciary on the international rights of humans?
I believe the judiciary should have a viewpoint, should have, being the imperative word, should have the viewpoint of upholding human rights. But then again, we saw what happened with the activists under the UAPS, so I will not be commenting on that. But yeah, they should have a different sort of a viewpoint and a different sort of a ideology when it comes to human rights. One should think not from here but from their heart that in their heart if that's right. But nowadays judges don't feel that way. So let's leave it at that.
Okay, ma'am. So the next question is by Biman Nath. The question is, are the NGOs powerful enough to protect a human right on a global scale?
Well, Indian NGOs are not. I don't believe they are. Right? And that is mainly because they are too afraid. Right? Um, I feel that if there was unity and if there was more awareness about their own rights as NGOs, if they had their own awareness, I believe it could be better. I am an optimist. I believe it could be better. But at this point, in present, I feel that no, it's not. At this moment, it's not.
Okay, ma'am. So the next question is by Ms. Yashika. How does human rights provide the privileges or the right for minor girls and pregnant women?
See, human rights basically means that one is being treated equally, right? Of course, with minors, it's a different issue, but there is a charter for women, children, as well as people with disabilities, right? I discussed this a while back. But I feel that with women also, like with pregnant women, they're still women, right? So they obviously have the same rights as normal women, because pregnant women are normal women. But what I mean to say is that obviously their rights don't change. Rather, I feel that their rights increase since they are in that situation, which is very, very sensitive. They need to have a better care for that time. So that's why I feel that pregnant women have more rights as opposed to women in general. But as far as minor children are concerned, I feel that they have the same rights, I mean, under the UN charter. So yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, ma'am. So the next question is by Ms. Radhika. The question is, can you tell us the difference between human rights in India and the international countries?
Well, internationally, I believe that people are more they're more inclined to follow the human rights. I feel that internationally people have a little bit of sensitivity towards other humans, is what I feel. But in India, like we said, because since now UAP has come into the picture, let's just um, talk about it. Let's talk about it. So UAP basically has curtailed, I feel they have curtailed the human rights to some extent, because there are so many things that you could have done before the coming of UAPA, but now everything has become very, very risky. If you go out, you protest, which is a right that is guaranteed in the constitution. You can peacefully protest, but now if you go out and do that, it is an offense now under the UAPA, because somehow because Indians see, with India, I always feel that it's about the government that is ruling, right? And as of right now, I feel that that sort of a freedom that we would have 6 years ago is not the same which is now. This is what my feeling is. One can feel differently about this, but with the bringing of UAPA, my fears have come a little true.
Okay. So, ma'am, another question by Dr. Amit Kumar Das. The
Yeah.
question is, can an individual approach international human rights directly? If so, under what circumstances?
No, that cannot happen. Like I previously discussed when I was talking about Kulbhushan Jadhav, had Kulbhushan Jadhav been an individual, he couldn't have approached the ICJ. Um, but since he was a political prisoner in a way, he had to, right? So a person cannot be allowed to just go and approach the court unless they have exhausted all their possibilities in their own nation. Like every nation has their own set of courts. They have district level courts, they have high courts and supreme courts. So all of that has obviously been there. And I just read the question which just came up on the screen, and I totally agree. That is actually the case. I completely agree. Since 2014, it has happened, but if we say any further, we would be arrested. So it's better to refrain at this point of time. It's better to refrain.
So, another question by Ananya question is that does the terrorism come under the ambit of Article 6 of the International
Yes, I mentioned this
Covenant of
before. Yes,
Yes, ma'am.
it does. I mentioned this, that you are innocent until you're proven guilty. I gave the example of Chehel versus United Kingdom, as we had discussed earlier. Trouble, but he was treated like a human first. So that is why his rights were protected. Yes.
Look, ma'am,